I'd like to open this session on behalf of all of our presenters today by acknowledging the traditional custodians from the lands on which we meet and pay respect to elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. Now, the format today will be 3 short presentations followed by a panel discussion, and we're going to hold all questions until the end. But please, if as you're listening you have a question, pop it in the conference app. Normally, presenters love it when you keep your phone away. I want you all to have your phone out. I want you to open the session in the program on the app and ask your questions that way. We are recording this session, so that will ensure I can repeat your question back and we get good audio off it. So that is how we're taking questions. So please use the app. I also need to let you know that you will be receiving a certificate of attendance for this Congress, and all of the slides will be made available to you within the week. And if you could pop your phones on silent, but again not off because we need you to use the app, that would be great. All right, well, we will make a start, and first off the bat is myself. So hello there, I'm Jonathan Meddings, Chair of the Darwin Institute and author of The Final Cut, The Truth About Circumcision, and I'm here today to talk to you about the impact of circumcision on penile sensitivity and sexual function. But to understand that, we first need to understand the functions of the foreskin that are lost by circumcision when it's removed. There are many, and these are just some of them. Sensitivity is perhaps the most obvious. The foreskin is highly erogenous tissue. It contains an abundance of specialised fine touch receptors and other corpuscular receptors that together have a quite dynamic sensation when they're all firing. The foreskin also offers physical protection. The outer foreskin protects the inner foreskin and the head of the penis from chafing and infection, and it also provides adequate skin coverage, which is why the removal of too much of the foreskin by circumcision can result in painful, curved and shorter erections. The inner foreskin is a mucous membrane that contains cells that fight infection, and it's thought that an intact genital mucosa may be needed for future vaccines developed against STIs to be effective. The gliding action of the foreskin facilitates intromission or insertion of the penis, which is why circumcision increases penetration force by 10-fold. That gliding action also reduces friction and thereby reduces vaginal dryness, which is why women are more likely to experience vaginal dryness with circumcised partners. So as I mentioned, the foreskin is highly erogenous. It is the most sensitive part of the penis, but indeed it is the most sensitive part of the male body. And that's because it contains those corpuscular receptors that are highly sensitive to fine touch, the Meissner's corpuscles, or vibration, so the Pacinian corpuscles, but others that sense things like stretch and other kinds of actions. This compares to free nerve endings, which cannot sense fine touch, but rather sense hot, cold, deep pressure and pain. So it's interesting to note that free nerve endings outnumber corpuscles in the head of the penis, the glands, by 10 to 1. And that explains why the head of the penis, the glans penis, is not very sensitive at all. In fact, it's the second least sensitive part of the body after the heel of the foot. And to put that another way, the threshold for touch in the head of the penis is actually the pain threshold. So it seems obvious, doesn't it, that if we remove the most sensitive part of the penis, in fact the most sensitive part of the male body, which is the foreskin, by circumcision, and we leave behind the least sensitive part of the penis and the second least sensitive part of the male body, the head of the penis, that we are obviously reducing penile sensitivity through circumcision. So why have we had mixed study results when people have looked into this? Well, the simple answer is that most studies have relied on subjective survey-based responses, and most men can't even correctly identify their circumcision status, which is surprising, but it's what we find. All right, so The best study that we have to date on penile sensitivity was conducted by Sorrells and colleagues from 2007. It's the best we have because it used an objective measure. They exerted a known amount of pressure. It recorded sensation from participants when it was felt, not what they think they remember feeling at some point in the past when answering a survey in the present. Physicians were involved in the study, which enabled the correct identification of the circumcision status of participants. And it took measurements from 19 different sites on the penis, which is far more than any other study that's looked into this. And in fact, of the few other quantitative sensory studies that have been performed, those that reported no reduction in penile sensitivity either did not bother to test the sensitivity of the foreskin, which is why they found no reduction, or they only tested a single site on the outer foreskin. And in fact, it was Bossio there that found the site they tested on the outer foreskin was more sensitive than the other sites, yet they counterintuitively concluded that despite their results, circumcision has no impact on penile sensitivity. It's a clear example of researcher expectation bias, which we see all the time in the literature on this subject. You can see here the diagram showing the intact penis up the top and circumcised up the bottom. This was taken from Sorrell's study. You can see the 19 sites that they tested there. The colour chart shows you the most sensitive parts in that magenta or red colour, going down to purple, blue, light blue, green, and yellow being the least sensitive. And what you can see is that in the intact penis at the top, the most sensitive part is the frenulum and the foreskin. And of course, all of that's removed in the circumcised penis, where the most sensitive part is the circumcision scar, where any remnant of the foreskin remains. It's also interesting to note that, as I mentioned, the head of the penis is the least sensitive there in the yellow, but the circumcised penis, it's less sensitive still, because the absence of the protective foreskin layer means that the head of the penis undergoes chafing and keratinization and more closely resembles skin than the mucous membrane that it actually is. I should also add that this is the best study we have, but it's not without its limitations. They did use a monofilament to exert pressure on a single point. So although the results here are quite stark, they do not really capture the sensation that's lost, because what they can't tell you is how all of those different corpuscular receptors that are all firing at the same time, for fine touch, for vibration, for stretch and other things, that dynamic sensation, there's no way to measure that other than to really feel it. All right, well, what about circumcision and erectile dysfunction here? There's two main points I'd like to make. The first is that there are clearly objective physical impacts to circumcision. It does reduce penile sensitivity, which, as we all know, is an important part of achieving and maintaining arousal. But there are also subjective psychological impacts, and whether circumcision is seen to enhance or diminish sexual pleasure and performance depends to some extent, and for many to a great extent, on whether or not individuals think it will. Okay, circumcision and premature ejaculation. Here, I need to tell you up front what the bulbocavernosus reflex is. It's a big word, but it's a reflex with an associated muscle of the same name, the bulbocavernosus muscle, and it's the rhythmic contraction of this muscle along with some others that facilitates ejaculation. It's very important for that. And that's why it's really interesting that we know that this reflex, this bulbocavernosus reflex, is clinically non-excitable in 73% of circumcised men, compared to just 8% of intact men. So circumcision would appear to dampen this reflex quite significantly. And that explains why some studies have shown that circumcised men have what's called a longer intravaginal latency time. It's a fancy way for saying they last longer in bed because of that diminished reflex and, of course, the diminished sensitivity. And yet, circumcised men are also more likely to experience premature ejaculation. And so that raises a really obvious and interesting question, which is how can circumcision make it more difficult for some men and too easy for others to orgasm? And the answer is a combination of psychology and a history of erectile dysfunction. So some men with a history of ED report that their rapid ejaculation is due to concern they will lose their erection. All right, key takeaways. If you take away nothing else today from my presentation, I want you to know this. I want you to know that circumcision always removes the highly erogenous foreskin tissue and reduces penile sensitivity, that it often makes ejaculation more difficult by diminishing the bulbocavernosus reflex, that it sometimes results in erectile dysfunction due to reduced penile sensitivity and psychological impacts, and that while circumcision itself probably doesn't directly cause premature ejaculation, some circumcised men might experience this secondary to their erectile dysfunction. Well, what can you do about all of this? Well, I want you to question the normalisation of non-consensual, medically unnecessary male genital cutting. I want you to challenge cultural attitudes that perpetuate this harmful practice. And I want you to consider the circumcision status of your patients when they present for sexual dysfunction and mental harms. All right, my references will pop up. And I'll end by saying that that was a very quick overview of this subject, and I go into much more detail in Chapter 2 of my book, The Final Cut, The Truth About Circumcision. And also I have to say that the loss of function, reduced penile sensitivity, and the potential for sexual dysfunction that is associated with male circumcision is clearly demonstrated by the medical evidence and yet rarely discussed in the medical settings in which it's promoted and performed, and we need to change that. Thank you.